So then what's up? Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be answering a couple of points made by Devapriyaji.
Christianity says the man who lived in the first century in Israel, Jesus, as the Jewish Messiah. The word Jewish Messiah has been changed to a Son of God, which is not in the Hebrew Bible at all. This is a Greek observation of Greek.
The Son of God is found in these verses. Genesis 6:4 referring to the great men of repute. Exodus 4:22 says the nation of Israel itself is the Son of God. 2 Samuel 7:14 says Solomon is called the Son of God. Job 1:6 says the angels are called as Son of God. So Son of God is used to denote Israel, Israelites, kings, judges, prominent men and noblemen, and angel and angelic beings. So this term was usually commonly used in the Old Testament, and this is also synonymously used with other terms like Messiah. Psalms 2, which is usually considered as a messianic Psalms, mentions about a prophetic king who is called the Son of God, a king who is to be established in Zion, and God commands that all other kings and rulers of the earth must serve this Lord, King, Son of God. Similarly, Isaiah 9, which is another messianic chapter, mentions about a son who is called Mighty God and a Prince of Peace. And Isaiah 7 also mentions the future Messiah would be called Emmanuel, God with us. So this kind of situation where we see Son of God, Messiah, Savior being used interchangeably is very common in the Old Testament. Yes, it is true that the Messiah as such denotes only the anointed one, but it doesn't mean that it is not denoting the Son of God.
Which they even call it as Aryan. Max Muller says is the story of Jesus was made up from the story of Buddha.
Here I want to mention about Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? The alleged parallels between the stories of Jesus and those of pagan gods or divine men like Buddha are not actually close. In other cases, the parallels are simply made up by the copycat theorist. Where do any of the ancient sources speak of a divine man who was crucified as an atonement for sin? So far as I know, there are no parallels to this central Christian claim. Dying to atone for sin was not part of the ancient pagan mythology. So Devapriyaji is wrong again. There is no such thing as copycat theory where Jesus Christ was copied from other pagan sources.
In 1 Corinthians, he says, he has got holy secret, which God was waiting for this moment, this being the last generation, and the Son of God is sent. So he is born for a woman, born under law. This is what he uses in Galatians 4:5. And as per which means that it's a natural birth. There is no such virgin birth in the time of Paul writing in 55:16.
This is a quote from Professor Helen K. Bond from the Historical Jesus book. While Matthew and Luke are unlikely to have been earlier than the 80s CE, these two traditions of virgin birth clearly predate this date. Galatians 4:4 itself could possibly denote a virgin birth because in the cultural context they used to always denote by the father, Jesus Christ, the son of Joseph. Here Paul is specifically saying born of a woman rather than saying born of a man, which could refer to a virgin birth. We cannot be sure based on this point. So Devapriyaji claiming that this is a proof of a natural birth is unfounded. Paul was contemporary of Luke. It's very much possible that he was aware of Luke's gospel. He literally repeats verbatim from Gospel Luke in 1 Timothy 5:17-18 and 1 Corinthians 11:23-26. And Paul never disputed the virgin birth in any of his writings. So this is actually an argument from silence and not anything based on the text of the Bible.
And here in Corinthians 7:29, he says the time for the day of Lord is so short, let the married live as if they are unmarried. That is, you don't need to have sex anymore because the day of Lord is very short. See, today entire Christianity stands on Paul's command that you don't need circumcision. The same Paul said, let the married need not have relationship with his wife.
Well, 1 Corinthians 7 has a context. Now we need to understand that. The first verse itself says, it's good for a man not to have sex with a wife. He is not actually saying that. He is actually quoting what the Corinthians were asking about. This chapter is dealing about a particular question that the Corinthians were asking, and this is a quotation of the saying by the Corinthians, not by Paul. It's good for a man not to have sex with a woman. It is not a statement by Paul, it is by the Corinthians which he is quoting. And there is no Christian commentary that says that this is a command against having sex with your wife. So literally there is no commentary which says that you should not be having sex. In fact, in verse 3, Paul commands that husband and wife should satisfy each other's sexual desires. They should have sex. That's what he is saying. In verse 3, he is saying that he should have sex. So there is a context to this chapter which Devapriyaji intentionally ignores. In verse 32, I want you to be free from concerns. A man who isn't married is concerned about the Lord's concern, how he can please the Lord. Here again, he is speaking against all worldly concerns and all worldly desires and intentions. He is not directly speaking against having sex. Here again, Devapriyaji is misquoting Paul. It's probable that Paul was not even mentioning the day of the Lord in this verse, because that term, the day of the Lord, is not even mentioned in those verses. It's probable that he was saying that the life itself is very limited. Our existence itself is very limited, and we should be very careful about how we spend the time, not to be attached to worldly things and to be more heavenly and godly minded.
So now I am quoting verbatim from the Bible, the book by the Bible Unearthed by Director Archaeology of Israel and also Professor Archaeology from Tel Aviv University. He says the historical saga that contained in the Bible, that God choosing Abraham from Babylon and his deliverance of his people from Egypt under Moses and rise and fall of kingdom of Judea and Israel are all not divine revelations but fruitful products of human imagination. Archaeology has proved that there was never a Judea, there was never a Israel existed at all. The population of Israel was very low till the Greek period. They got civilization only under Greek and Romans.
Here again, he is completely misquoting Israel Finkelstein, and I don't understand what he is really trying to say. If he has read the book, he is very doubtful. Professor Israel is actually very doubtful about the dating of the events rather than just saying that all the events are just fiction. In fact, he even admits that David and Solomon could have very well existed. What he is actually saying in his book is that there is not enough archaeological evidence to actually support this history, right? So you cannot say that something did not happen just because we don't have archaeological evidence for a particular incident or a particular situation. Not everything, not everyone, not every scenario leaves behind an archaeological evidence. That is what the whole book is about. Here again, he is misquoting Israel Frankenstein completely. And in fact, it is necessary to also understand that Professor Israel represents one view of the spectrum. He is not the only final authority in archaeology. There are other people who contradict him, who are against him. So there is a debate going on between archaeologists about how to interpret these facts. But rather than presenting the consensus, rather than presenting that this debate is going on, Devapriyaji quotes one historian and tries to really prove his confirmation bias here. There are people who also believe that Exodus happened. Professor David A. Falk, who has an entire YouTube channel, who has a lot of evidence to show that Exodus really did happen, that there are archaeological evidence for that and historical evidence. So he simply doesn't seem to be grasping the scholarly spectrum that is there in biblical archaeology.
Now, camels being used as house animals happened only in 2nd century BC and not 20th century BC as far as Abraham's day. These are all I'm quoting from the highest archaeologists. Camel came to Israel in around 8th or 9th century for mines and war.
Almost all archaeologists who are studying this topic have commented that domesticated camels came to Middle East around 10th to 7th century, somewhere around there. So this is a quote directly from Bible Unearthed, whose writer is Israel Frankenstein, which Devapriyaji is very often quoting. He mentions that the domesticated camel came to Middle East in around 10 to 9 BC. Here again, there are other archaeologists like Erez, Ben-Yosef and Lidar Sapir-Hen of Tel Aviv University, who are all colleagues of Israel Finkelstein, who say that in the Mediterranean region, camel came and they were domesticated by the 10th century BC.
The entire Old Testament was made up only between 2nd century BC to 1st century AD.
Here is a claim that is completely taking me by surprise. So if the Old Testament mentions about domesticated camels, and the domesticated camels only existed from 2nd century BC, therefore the text has been written only during the 2nd century, is that how really that works? As I already told you, the camels did exist way back even at the time of 10th century BC. So from that analysis, shall we claim that the Bible was written from the 10th century BC to 1st century AD? Would Devapriyaji accept that?
This situation, as per archaeology, there was never Judea, there was never Israel till Greek period. The entire stories were made up. The Second Temple period.
There is a quote from the same book that Devapriyaji is quoting often, Bible Unearthed. Here, Professor Israel is saying, towards the end of the 7th century BC, scribes, priests, peasants and prophets came together to create a new movement and started writing up the Bible. So he is saying it could have been written as early as 7th century BC. Professor Israel Finkelstein himself is saying it could have been written in around 7th century BC. Oh, right. So I'm going to be referring from another book which is called as Rise of Ancient Israel. In this book, there are a lot of references to show the early history and archaeology, to show the early history and archaeology of Israel. This is the Merneptah stele, which is an Egyptian slate dating from 1207 BC, that is 12th century BC, which mentions about the term Israel being conquered or being destroyed by the Egyptians. So Israel existed way back in 12th century BC at least. Professor Baruch Halprin also says this particular depiction seen in the Egyptian museum is considered by majority of the scholars to represent a particular shepherd king called as Hyksos, who most of the scholars consider to be denoting Joseph of the Bible. And again he is quoting Professor Finkelstein because he says that the Bible, the Deuteronomical history, bears unmistakable hallmarks of the initial compilation in the 7th century BC. So the Deuteronomical history dates back to at least 7th century BC, not 2nd century. There are multiple quotes from Professor where he says that the Deuteronomy is been written at least from the 7th century BC.
See, the oldest portion of the Bible is from Abraham. The latest portion is building of Second Temple and Ezra reading the verses. Now, as per archaeology, not a single brick has been built in Jerusalem during Persian period. All of this has happened only in Hasmonean period, and this is the period the Bible has been written.
Now, certainly, again quoting from Bible Unearthed, Professor Finkelstein again says that Israel, a century of archaeological excavation in Jerusalem has indicated that the capital of Judah, which is Jerusalem, grew to become a significant city at about the same time as 8th century. In 10th century BC, Jerusalem was no more than a small village, but in 8th century BC, it was already becoming a significant city. So again, the claim that Jerusalem did not exist at all till the 2nd century BC is a lie. It is not a misrepresentation or something, it is a lie from Devapriyaji.
In Hebrew, in Egypt, not a single name or single item has been found that can be linked with Hebrews.
No. There are a lot of stuff in Egypt and in Israel which link both the cultures. There is a sharing of language. There is a lot of archaeological evidence to show this. Refer to Professor David Falk, he has a lot of evidence for this. This is a Jacob scarab which dates back to actually 18th century BC and is thought to have belonged to a Canaanite king named Jacob. This Jacob may have been an ancestor of another Jacob, a Hyksos king who ruled Egypt about a century later. So this could be the father of Joseph. We cannot be sure, but there are archaeological evidences that are being considered seriously by historians. And we already saw this image in the Egyptian paintings which depicts a person similar to that of Joseph, a shepherd king. And here is a Merneptah stele which mentions about Israel back in the 12th century BC.
The oldest of which was Isaiah, which could be dated around 150 in the BCE, in the Dead Sea Scroll, probably the oldest book.
So right, what he is saying is that if you find the oldest manuscript of a particular literature, that is when it was written. So let's use the same argument on Rig Veda and Ramayana. The oldest manuscript that we have of Rig Veda is from the 12th century BC? No, it's 12th century AD. The oldest manuscript of Ramayana is from 11th century AD, after Christ. Yeah, after Christ, not before Christ. 12th century AD and 11th century AD. So does this mean, according to his argumentation and reasoning, does this mean that both the books were written in the 11th century AD and 12th century AD? Would you accept that?
His parents' name changes in every gospel. See, if you take it to Jesus' father is Joseph, son of Jacob. Whereas if you go into Luke, Joseph, son of Eli. See, son of Eli and son of Jacob cannot be same person.
This has been dealt by scholars several times. There are two ways of dealing with it. One is that Luke is talking about the Mary's genealogy, and another is that Matthew is talking about Joseph's genealogy. This is very commonly accepted by the scholars. Other interpretation is that given by Eusebius, he shows how it is possible based on Deuteronomical laws that a person can have two fathers. Even though he is born of one father, he can have one biological father and one legal father. So that is definitely possible. That is another explanation for the contradiction.
He comes to Judea from Nazareth to get his baptism of repentance. Forgiveness of sins.
Not all baptisms are for forgiveness or for the sake of sin. Professor Ellen K. Bond, again in her book, mentions that ritual bathing and baptism were commonly used among first century Jews, and it was not necessarily about only cleansing from sin. It was also as a representation of the fact that the person was already pure. So if you are already pure and clean and righteous, you can still get baptized. Doesn't mean that you need to be baptized only because you are a sinner. Similarly, Josephus also mentioned in Antiquities 18:116 that baptism was for those who were already repentant and purification, and not necessarily a purification from sin itself. It was meant for someone who was already purified too.
Now, I had put a question in the blog of Bart Ehrman, Professor Bart Ehrman. Did Mark conveniently hide that he also worked in Judea? Because now you should take the Gospel of John. He says Jesus was traveling between Judea and Galilee, and especially in John 4 chapter, he said when Jesus was in Judea, they came across also John the Baptist, and this was the time before John the Baptist was arrested, which means that entire story of Mark is wrong. So I had put the question, is Mark lying, or Mark hided it, or John hided it? And Professor Bart Ehrman said both could have done it. Probably, I said Mark is doing it politically, maybe possible. On the other hand, but John, the evangelist John could have done, because he believed a prophet should come from
literally nothing is being said like that. He is again misquoting Professor Bart Ehrman. 90% of what he is saying is not in those quotations. You can see there, literally he has said only a few sentences, one or two sentences in the entire conversation. But Devapriyaji wants to build a mountain out of a mole.
Bart Ehrman was his student, and he says none of the Gospels are reliable.
Here again, he is making a blanket statement that Gospels are unreliable. That's not at all the case at all. Even atheistic, skeptical scholars do not completely just brush it aside and call the Gospels as fiction. That is not at all true. There is a whole group of scholars, as shown here, who actually believe that the Gospels represent ancient Greco-Roman biographies. So what he is doing is, by referring to Bart Ehrman, he is really trying to appeal to one particular person who is accepting his viewpoints and showing his confirmation bias again. And he is appealing to authority. Both the fallacies here.
Now again, go to the revelations. We saw that when he was sending his disciples, he said, go unto the Gentiles, do not go to Gentiles, do not go to Samaritans, but go to the revelations. Here it says, only 144,000 people will enter into the final place. Now, there is one more class in the chapter 7, which says there are tremendous amount of people waiting in the outside. See, that is equivalent to a stadium where the people are playing. So,
I've already dealt with this problem already in my videos before answering my Aram. This is completely out of context. There is no scholar, no skeptic, no Jew or Muslim that interprets these terms in such a way. The only people who do it are the Jehovah's Witness cult. Nobody else does it. This is completely out of the way, and the exegesis is completely wrong. Revelation 7:14 to 17 also mentions that this whole group of people who are sitting in the stadium watching the match, that's what he is saying, they were clothed in white linen, which is similar to those whose names were written in the book of life. Those whose names were written in the book of life will enter heaven. That's what it is. The context of the Revelation says that. And they are said to serve God before his throne, in his presence, day and night. What does it mean by serving God in his presence? It is, of course, in heaven. These people will be in heaven. That is what the whole point of the verses. It's again misquoting, misrepresenting the verses again.
Did Jesus do any miracle? This is a question you need to ask the Bible. And as per 1 Corinthians 1:26, Paul in the year 56, he wrote, Jews are expecting miracles. Jews expected miracles, and Greek want wisdom. We don't have any. We have the story of a dead man, Jesus, who died on the cross.
Paul certainly believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is completely accepted by all theologians and historians. There is no problem at all. Did Paul believe that Jesus Christ did miracles? He mentions the resurrection, so that's enough to say that he believed in the miracles of Jesus Christ. And Josephus Flavius also mentions about the supposed miracles of Jesus Christ. Check out my latest video on Josephus and to know the reliability of the testimony of Flavius, where he speaks about Jesus and his miracles, his ministry and his death. Once again, Celsus, who was a pagan, polemic against Jesus Christ and other Jewish sources, also mentioned that Jesus was a sorcerer, a magician. So that's a derogatory term, but that shows that the people did know that Jesus was doing miracles, and that is indirect evidence that Jesus was doing miracles. Here he claims that Paul is the earliest tradition in the Bible. That is not true. The pre-Pauline Christian creed, which is mentioned in the 1 Corinthians 15, which talks about the resurrection account and how many people that Jesus saw after his resurrection, that is a clear evidence of a pre-Pauline creed. It dates back to within few months to years of the death of Jesus Christ. I did not say that. atheist and skeptical, hyper-skeptical historian Richard Carrier said that. Check out the description. He says that.
People say soul. I mean, in Tamil they call Atma death. So there is no soul as far as Christian theology is concerned. See,
again, totally false statement. The terms like soul, spirit appears like almost more than 1,000 times in the Bible. Soul alone appears at least 700 times in the Bible.
Deuteronomy 32:8, it says, God alone gave each nation a place and he assigned God for each nation, and for Yahweh it was given Israel.
As you can see the verse here, this verse mentions nothing about God having different gods assigned to different nations. That's completely not at all present in the context of the verse. I mean, it simply says that there are different nations and different boundaries, and then God chose Israel or Jacob for his own like chosen race. That's the only thing that you can get from this verse. And I understand that the Israelis were polytheistic back then in the olden days, but this verse that doesn't prove that.
Totally. Not you take one verse saying that Jesus agreed to Gentiles. No, Jesus called a girl dog, a Greek girl. On the face of it, the bread is for the children and it cannot be given to dogs.
ஐயா தேவப்பிரியா ஐயா, நான் தான் டாம் கிறிஸ். தயவு செஞ்சு என்னுடைய ரிக்வஸ்ட்டை ஏற்றுக்கோங்க. தயவு செஞ்சு ஒரு டிபேட்டுக்கோ ஒரு டிஸ்கஷனுக்கு தயவு செஞ்சு முன்வாங்க. நீங்கள் ஒரு உண்மையிலே பெரிய பைபிள் ஸ்காலர் நான் நம்புறதுனால தான் உங்களுக்காக தனியாக ஒரு வீடியோவே இப்போ கிரியேட் பண்ணியிருக்கேன். நீங்கள் இதே மாதிரி ஒரு டிபேட்டுக்கோ ஒரு டிஸ்கஷனுக்கோ வந்தீங்கன்னா ரொம்ப நன்மையாக இருக்கும். நம்ம நிறைய விஷயம் தெரிஞ்சுக்கலாம். நிச்சயமாக நீங்கள் என்ன ஈஸியாக தோக்கடிச்சிடலாம், அதில் எனக்கு டவுட்டே இல்லை. நான் அதை தோற்று தான் போகிறேன். ஆனால் I just want to know your viewpoints. I just want to have a proper discussion and debate. அப்படி பேசினா தான் நம்மளால் ஒருத்தர் நம்மளால் புரிஞ்சிக்க முடியும். இல்லைனா நம்ம பாட்டுக்கிட்டு நம்ம ஒரு எக்கோ சேம்பரில் உட்காந்து கத்திட்டே இருக்க மாதிரி தான் இருக்கும். இந்த வீடியோவில் நீங்கள் பார்த்துருப்பீங்க, வெறும் 20 நிமிஷம் தான் பேசியிருக்கீங்க. கிட்டத்தட்ட 20 மிஸ்டேக்கு மேலே நீங்கள் பண்ணுறீங்க. அதனால் இதில் நம்ம டிஸ்கஸ் பண்ணால் தான் நம்மளால் சார்ட் அவுட் பண்ண முடியும். ப்ளீஸ் கம் ஃபார்வர்ட் ஃபார் அ டிபேட், லைவ் டிபேட் ஆன் யூடியூப். தேங்க்யூ.